Hey everyone! So today we're diving into when to plan, how much to plan for, and all the nitty-gritty in between. So, want to preface this video. I'm talking from a lot of Michigan-based experience. Some of it just may be Michigan rules and regulations. I'm not giving legal advice here. I'm not a lawyer, so always seek out, other information as well. So the main question, when do you start planning? Now, yesterday, 2 days ago. There's kind of the story within an industry. It's, the 80-year-old man goes in to make arrangements for his 104-year-old mother who just died and says, gosh, this was unexpected. We never talked about it. We never planned for it. At that point, should have had that conversation over 30 years ago. But they didn't. So have the topic at your dinner table, have the conversation on a date night. It's not fun. No one ever wants to talk about this. Talk about what you want. Talk about burial or cremation, wood or metal casket. What do we want to do? Where do you want to be? Nobody wants to talk about that, but it's important to have the conversation because otherwise your family's left guessing. What did they want? I don't know where to even bury them, especially when it comes to younger, folks, younger couples, 30-year-olds. Who wants to even have that conversation? You plan for 50 years together. You plan for a lifetime together. And a lifetime means 80, 90 years old to most people. So you don't talk about what cemetery do you want to be buried in. If you're cremated, what are we doing with your cremated remains? But I think also in that conversation, it's not just you sharing what your wishes are for yourself, but it's also asking your family, your parents, or your kids, do my wishes work for you? If I'm just cremated and scattered and, there's no other formal anything, does that work for you? Does that meet your needs? Is that what you want? Will that help you in the long run? And I think that that conversation also has to come into play. One good example is, let's say I died and wanted to be cremated, and my husband said, okay, I'm just going to keep your cremated remains at home with me because I want you with me. Well, my parents who are still living, my brother, sister, my family, how does that meet their needs? Where can they go to visit me? Where can they go to see me? Are they going to knock on my husband's door and say, hey, I want to come visit Kari today? Not likely. So, maybe creating that common space, maybe burying a portion of the cremated remains so it's accessible to everybody to go up that place to go to. What about the, I had another good one. Oh, so like, my husband wants to keep my cremated remains and, down the road, he dies. Well, then what are we doing? What do the kids want to do with both parents then? Do they want to bring us home? Do we want to, you've got to convey, hey, when mom and dad are both gone, this is what we want you to do with the cremated remains. Because they may be creeped out by the fact that they don't want you inside their house in a box, an urn or in a box in the closet or wherever they may put you. So you have to have that conversation kind of down the road with where you want those cremated remains put. So there's more than just the, hey, I want to be cremated. It's kind of get a little deeper, but have the conversation. Even if it's not with your spouse, if you're not comfortable, tell your best friend, let somebody that's important, that's accessible, know what you want. Call a funeral home that you maybe want to work with down the road. And get a price list from them just so you have a ballpark information on costs. I'll talk about a little more in just a few minutes, but definitely contact somebody and just get some information. Have a place in your house to write down, have a place for your birth certificate, your social security number, if you're a veteran, where your discharge is kept, things like that, so that way they're easily accessible to your family when the time comes, where your life insurance policies are, things like that. it seems like it would be logical that, oh, they're somewhere where I know where they are, or maybe my husband does. Well, what if you die together? If somebody had to come into your home, if you never came back, could they find what they need? Because tomorrow's not always a given. So, you know, when you leave your house, are things where somebody could find them? So, plan as much as you can ahead of time, update it every few years. Even like when I went on a vacation, I just typed up a quick thing for my parents and said, hey, if I die, this is who I want you to call for, this is who I want you to have embalm me, this is who I want to do my service, and etc. So just having a little silly note like that, even just so people know what's going on. But it's going to change. Every 10 years you're going to want to update. Every 5 years you may want to update those things. Get a will. If you don't already have one, you know, it's not a necessity, but sometimes it definitely would come in handy if you had a will and had it filed appropriately, had it legally filed. Just having something written out and signed and at home does not make it legal. Not at all. So you could do that as well. Do a trust, things of that nature. Always good to contact an attorney and get some of that in place, especially when you're near retirement years, that they can get your finances in order as well. So one area of planning I'm going to mention, it's a two-part thing. It's very, very important, I think. This is something I feel so strongly about because I've seen the other side of it, but you don't want to hear about, is when kids die and planning for your children. So parents of kids under 18, get a will. Get a will that says where those kids are going to go if you and your spouse die in an accident together. So there's a car accident, there's a husband and wife, they die, they have little kids at home. I've often talked to parents who say, well, my parents are going to just take them. It doesn't work that way. The court decides. If there is no will in place by the parents, the court is going to decide who gets care of your children. They may go into foster care for a while before the judge can decide. They may go have to live with somebody they don't know. So take care of them by getting your stuff in order. I feel so strongly about this because I've watched what happens afterwards if it's not into place. Imagine that you and your spouse have both divorced parents. You have 4 sets of grandparents fighting over these children. You know, all trying to battle in court, all trying to get them. Then you have aunts and uncles trying to get them. And I've had this situation a couple times, and sometimes it goes great, and sometimes it drags out for a long time where these children are in limbo. So get a will, get it enforced, get it legally put into place so that they know where your kids go, where you want your kids to go if something happens to you and your spouse together. So important. And then the other side of kids that I want to say is get a life insurance for your children. You don't want to think that your kid is going to die, but that money is not so that you can pay for their funeral so much. Think about if your child died, are you going back to work in a week? No. Are you going back to work in 2 weeks? A lot of times not. So that life insurance takes care of you and your home if something happens to your child in the most part. So it helps you pay the bills while you are not wanting to live any longer because your kid is gone. So it's going to help take care of your family to move forward financially going through that kind of a loss. So life insurance on your kids, can't stress that even enough. So get off my soapbox on that one. So costs. I'm not going to go into fine details of costs because it's all over the board. It truly is. National averages that you'll see published is usually around $6,500 to $10,000-ish for an average of a funeral. Now, if you come middle America here, like Midwestern states, is a lot less than as you go out to the coasts. So, you know, California and New York are going to be more expensive. Parts of Arizona, Florida, it just depends. There's higher costs in higher areas, just like there is buying a gallon of milk or buying gasoline. Same thing. Everything is, you know, raised in different areas. So, but a lot of these national costs that are published are not for everything. That's for the funeral home costs. So if you've ever gone and had to do planning on a funeral, you have your services of the funeral home. So that's going to be your overall service charge from the funeral home, your preparation work, visitation, service, the vehicle, staff. Then you're going to have your merchandise, your casket, your vault, your printed material, your urn. Then there's going to be a column called cash advance items. And those are items that the funeral home pays out on your behalf. So the day of the service, you typically are not carrying around a stack of envelopes to pay people like you often do at a wedding or other big events where you're paying each person individually. Well, the funeral home takes that costs on up front, and they pass that money out typically the day of the service. So the flowers, which often are between $300–500, the cemetery charges. So if you get to a nice little country cemetery, they may only charge you $25 for a grave space still. May charge you $300 for opening and closing. But when you get into larger cemeteries, memorial parks, you could be paying upwards of $15,000–$2,000 for a grave space, $2,000 to $3,000 for opening and closing. It just, you know, depends on the area once again. But that can also add several $1,000s to your bill just at the cemetery costs. Obituary, right here, our local papers, where I am, is average $300 for an obituary, and that's just a medium size, no frills, basic information obituary. And a lot of it is, you know, Sunday costs a little more because there's only 3 days a week that they do home delivery. So the newspaper industry is all changed within the funeral business, but obituaries are another heavy cost. Then you have clergy, pianists, luncheon, kind of everything if you had your stuff at a church. Now, a lot of people think, oh, I'm a member of the church, I don't have to pay anything. Yes, you do. Those people still need to be compensated. They're not going to sit and tell you, yes, you need to pay me, oftentimes, because they feel bad about wanting to be paid for their services. But they put a lot of time into what they're doing. They put a lot of effort, and so they need to be paid as well. So oftentimes they will tell the funeral home or come back around to the funeral home afterwards and say, where's my check? And if the family hasn't paid them directly, then we have to go all the way back through the process and charge the family or call the family, or they have to just not be paid. So be prepared. It's not free at your church typically. But that all gets added to your bill at the funeral home. So all these outside costs are added in there, so it looks like the funeral home's charging this huge amount when a good chunk of it is not the funeral home charges actually, but it's part of the final expenses, so to speak. And then typically later the headstone or the monument at the cemetery would come, and that's going to be there's a huge ballpark. I would say from 500 up, just depending on so many variables. That's a whole nother topic of conversation. But so you're looking at $10,000 to $13,000 on average for a funeral if you get all of your expenses included in there. And that's going to be for a full traditional kind of one-day viewing, funeral, burial, luncheon sort of thing. I like to point out too, just like with any business, each company sets their own prices. So 2 funeral homes next to each other could be completely different in their costs. And it's all dependent on overhead of running the business. You know, a funeral home is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week business. Unlike other businesses that say that, they truly are. You know, at 2 in the morning, if somebody dies, somebody's answering that phone, somebody is putting on a suit, getting in a vehicle, coming to your home, coming to the hospital, getting your loved one, bringing them back to the funeral home, and going from there. So there are costs associated with keeping a business like that running. You know, some funeral homes charge more for the service side. Sometimes their merchandise markup is more. It just depends on how they find their business can run most effectively and most with the most income from what they are getting. You know, they may have months where they have, like a small town funeral home may only have 2 calls for the whole month, but then the next month they may have 12. So having to balance a business around that variable of volume is really hard to do when you have such fluctuation on what's actually coming in. But they still have to keep the lights on. They still have to keep people there and working, and still have to keep things going to be able to take care of your loved ones. So I think that all has to be remembered and thought about, because if I make the comment, and I'm sure somebody has thought it, that if I make that comment, you know, we have to worry about how much we're making, and someone thinks, oh, but somebody died, how can you just think about money? Well, at the end of the day, it is a business, and we have to think about money, or else that business isn't going to be there tomorrow to be able to take care of your family. So it's that, you know, it's sometimes you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you know, we want to take care of people, but we have to charge money for that in order to be able to keep doing it. So I like to point that out because it's such a slippery slope, I think. So back to some of the costs. So cremation, we went over kind of burial ranges. You're going to always see billboards for those if you're getting into a bigger area, you know, $9.95 cremations or $500 cremations or whatever that price is. But you know, you get to smaller towns, it's going to be probably a little more because there's not that crazy competition like you have in a bigger city. So you might get up to $4,000 for a direct cremation. And it's all about that overhead and about just different costs that that funeral home might have. And a direct cremation is just that basic bringing the person into the care of the funeral home, having them cremated, doing all the paperwork associated, and returning them back to you as a family, kind of a no-frills service. But I like to always say, just remember, you kind of get what you pay for, in terms of don't walk into a Holiday Inn expecting a Hilton experience, you know, when you're paying a Holiday Inn price, because you kind of get what you pay for. And I'm not saying that they're going to do a poor job because you're paying, you know, that $9.95, because they can care about your family just the same that another can, but some of the extras and some of the frills just may not be there because it's not built into that overhead. So, you know, when someone in your life dies, I think it's, you know, do you want to pay the cheapest person to take care of them? Like, to me, because I don't know, I think that's such a weird way to look at it, but people want that lowest price, but this is the most important thing in your life as this person, and it comes down to money so often, and it's such a, it just, yeah, I don't know, it's one of those things that confuses me, I guess, about the business. There's a lot of costs though with cremation. You can do a full viewing and a full service and then have someone cremated, so that's definitely going to be a higher price. That's why, like I said, call a funeral home, get their price list, look it over, or talk to somebody and kind of get a breakdown of what costs would be, so you have a better idea. And especially once you've had that conversation with your family, you can get that price based on what you're thinking you want, and that way at least you know how to do that. So then you can maybe plan for those finances. So with costs, a lot of people get life insurance when you're younger and have that through your work maybe, or you know, you get a small policy here, a small policy there, or maybe your parents got a policy on you when you were young. Back in the day, back in the 40s and stuff, we would cash in these policies that were $250 or $500, which was a lot of money back then. But it doesn't go very far now when you're coming to the funeral home to take care of someone. Funeral costs almost double every 10 to 15 years in the industry. It's just kind of when you go back and look over how things have played out for the last however many years, that's kind of how often the costs are doubling. So if you plan now, imagine, you know, how that plays out over your life. So a lot of people will get life insurance policies. You get them now and you think you're set. Well, here's kind of the crappy part about the setup right now is that if you live long enough to get to the point, like you've lived to the point where you actually need to go into a nursing home and get nursing care. So all of your assets are going to have to be liquidated out to pay for that care. So you can go into private pay and pay down until you have nothing in the bank and all your assets are gone almost. And then you go into a state funded where then you have to get rid of even more assets, so to speak. And so that life insurance policy is considered an asset because you can cash it in. So if you've ever had to care for an elderly parent or somebody in your family, you may have had to go through this where you do a spend down. You actually have to spend everything down. You have to get less than $2,000 in their bank account. You have to liquidate everything they own, practically. And so you plan ahead only to have it kind of taken away because it's almost a penalty in the end for you. So life insurance, it's a great thing to have, but you don't know how it's going to play out in the long run because of that type of a situation. And we've seen that happen so much where people had great amount of wealth, and you get to the end and they just had nothing almost because everything had to be given out for their care. So another huge political topic, I'm sure, would go forever if everybody was talking about it. So the best plan of action, if it came to planning your finances ahead and putting money aside for it, is to actually do a prearrangement through a funeral home. Because that way your life insurance is connected to a funeral policy. So what you do is you would plan out what it is you wanted at the funeral home and they would give you that number. So you would do a life insurance policy that's connected to that amount, and then it's not an asset because it's connected to your funeral plan. A regular life insurance can't be connected to a funeral plan, but one through a funeral home can. It's just a different way of how they're set up and how they're connected. Or you can do a trust through a funeral home. It's kind of like a savings account that is set aside for you for your funeral, and you're taxed on it every year because it's still your money. A funeral home never owns that money. It's always given directly to a third party. So you're not going to lose it if that funeral home closes. You're not going to lose it if you move across the country. That money is always yours, set aside for your funeral. So you can go to any other funeral home and you can cash it in and use it with them. You can move across the country and just move it to, the money essentially stays in that third party, and then you can just use a different funeral home to cash it in. The only thing that sets with that, that's locked in with that funeral home that you did that prearrangement with, is the guarantee. So what you plan with them, if it's paid in full, is locked in and guaranteed. Those costs won't go up for you. It's set in stone for you. So like I said, if you do live to be, say I go tomorrow and plan and then I live to be 80, funeral costs will have doubled several times by the point that I would pass away, but my funeral will have been locked in at that lesser rate. My husband doesn't understand why everybody doesn't go do this, because it's so financially savvy to do, because it's such a great savings in the end, I guess. But the only part that's not locked in is those cash advance items, because the funeral home doesn't control them, so they're not going to take the responsibility of locking those in, but you can put money towards them. And just like in the trust, just like a savings account, you're going to get interest, and you'll have some more money in there in the end. So trust or life insurance through a funeral home is by far your best option if you want to lock in those costs. But if you want to just get a life insurance policy and have it and know that things will be covered, go for $20,000 probably if you want to be safe. I had that question from somebody in the insurance business, and I would say go for 20 just to kind of cover, if you wanted to make sure everything kind of in that final ballpark was covered. But really it's up to you once you figure out what your plan is and how much is needed for that. So I think it's just to kind of sum up, yeah, have that talk. You have to talk to your family. You have to know what they want. You have to know what works for them. They need to hear what you want, so that way they can make sure it's played out, and not just, oh man, I want this song played at my funeral, or I want this to happen, or I want that, or I want a wood casket. Talk about the nitty-gritty. Talk about where that burial is going to be, you know, because that's kind of a forever thing. And you can talk about how if you want to move towards making some deposits for financially kind of securing towards that as well. You know, nowadays most people are not planning enough for their retirement, let alone for their final expenses for the funeral home. So have the conversation, lay some things out with your spouse, your parents, your loved ones, and get a plan for yourself. So hopefully this answered most of the questions, and if you have more, by all means, you know, private message me or post comments or whatever you'd like to do. So thanks.